Yes, maybe starting from the end or from the second question, although I agree they are related. It's worth reminding ourselves of what the Euromaidan, but also before, other mass protests were about. If we think of the Orange Revolution in 2004, but also the anti-Kuchma protests. Kuchma was the president in the early 2000s. In 2001, those protests happened. It was always carried by basically the middle of society, and it was against corruption and for the rule of law. So it was that was the main driving force behind these protests, although the Euromaidan, as we know, was triggered by the then president Yanukovych not signing the association agreement with the EU, but that was the trigger, and probably to most people that would have been fairly abstract at the time and fairly what that agreement actually meant. But what was not abstract was that where one wanted to see Ukraine in the future, namely also with living standards like in the EU, but also basically a system that upholds the rule of law. So that is, I think, a powerful demonstration of where the choice for Ukraine's direction was made. And that I am convinced will also last into the post-war period, whenever that really starts. I see Zelensky as somebody who, he didn't really have an election program. That was his program, not to have one. And he was authentic for different reasons, and mainly also because the incumbent at the time miscalculated and sent out a much narrower message about what Ukraine was ultimately about in this army language and faith argument. But he had two points where he was a little more concrete, and that was ending the war, meaning ending the war in Donetsk and Luhansk, or parts of these territories, and fighting corruption. And of course, both did not happen to that extent. He did not end the war, and corruption, on the fight against corruption, he actually also continued some of his predecessors' work on establishing an institutional architecture to deal with aspects of corruption, but the implementation is still behind. So that is obviously one of the key issues that will matter, and matter a lot, or they do matter now, but they will also matter hugely in the aftermath of this war. I see, and I find it telling that even amidst this war, and a war of these dimensions, the president himself takes very clear actions when there are allegations or actually evidence of corruption now amidst war, and he's let people go, including from his closest political circles. So that I take as further commitment in that direction. And it's also an issue that is high on society's mind when people are asked, what will be the priorities of reconstruction? So looking beyond the war, they name fighting corruption as the absolute number one, and only with quite some distance, things like reconstructing hospitals, schools, and houses. And you could easily imagine that that would be the other way around. So I think in that sense, there's more continuity, and it will continue. But it's still a big issue, and the EU in its report on Ukraine has also highlighted those chapters of the EU acquis most where that work still needs to be done. And in terms of EU integration, it's closely linked to that. There was already under Zelensky in particular, also before him, but also public opinion still widened or strengthened in that direction, a clear consensus on EU integration, and I cannot see that waver at all at the moment. The political landscape in Ukraine will look different after the war, and we currently don't know what it will look like. There will have to be new parties, there will have to be new opposition. At the moment, it's a system that still surprisingly manages to have a parliament and pass legislation, and also important reform legislation is still being passed. But obviously the implementation is already mostly for a different era. So we don't know what the political scene will look like, but I don't currently, and what Zelensky's role in this will be, but I don't see any wavering from that drive for the rule of law and for EU integration. And hopefully, may I add, hopefully in December, the EU will decide to actually open negotiations with Ukraine, which would be a very important step in this process.